Years since Vladimir Putin launched a deadly and unprovoked full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is Europe's largest military conflict since World War II, with Ukraine losing tens of thousands of troops and Russia losing hundreds of thousands. That's according to the New York Times. Despite the atrocities inflicted on the Ukrainians at the hands of Moscow, the Trump administration has left little doubt that they are taking Putin's side. Just take a listen to Trump's Secretary of Defense and National Security Advisor over the weekend.
But fair to say, Russia attacked unprovoked into Ukraine 3 years ago tomorrow.
Fair to say it's a very complicated situation.
Can you acknowledge that Russia is the aggressor here?
Well, you know what? Who would you rather having go toe-to-toe with the likes of Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un, Xi, or anyone else? Joe Biden or Donald Trump? He's the deal maker in chief.
Today at the White House, French President Emmanuel Macron met with Donald Trump to try to convince the United States that it is in their interest and the world's interest for the United States to stand up to Putin. And at one point, Macron had to correct Trump on the nature of Europe's support for Ukraine.
Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total default, and it was through, like the US, loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money, to be clear.
Joining our coverage, Ambassador Michael McFaul, former ambassador to Russia, MSNBC international affairs analyst. Also joining us, senior correspondent for Time Magazine, covering international affairs, author of The Showman, Inside the Invasion That Shook the World and Made a Leader Out of Vladimir Zelensky. Simon Schuster's here. Let me start with you, Simon, on Zelensky's ability to constantly change the equation, offering over the weekend to step down in exchange for NATO membership for Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, he has to also answer to his people. You know, he's negotiating with Donald Trump, but a lot of what he's been saying in standing up to Trump and in telling him that he's not going to sign these onerous draft agreements that Trump is putting in front of him, you know, he's answerable to his own people. And I think he's done a pretty strong job so far of telling the Ukrainian people that, look, I'm not going to sign away the natural resources that belong not to the president of Ukraine, but to the people of Ukraine and future generations. So that took a lot of courage, I think, given the importance of the relationship with the United States. And what it's created here in Kyiv, you know, talking to officials and just regular people here, is a kind of rally around the leader effect, where a lot of the tensions that had begun to emerge between different political forces here have quieted down. And people now feel that while Zelensky is continuing to fight the war against Russia, he's also now standing up to what is supposed to be Ukraine's closest and most important ally, the United States. So that's been interesting to see here in the last couple of days. But I think now it feels like to many Ukrainians, their president and their leadership is fighting on two fronts: a diplomatic war with Ukraine's would-be closest ally, and of course continuing to fight the Russians.
How bizarre is it, Ambassador McFaul, to have an American president on the world stage trying to take another country's natural resources?
Bizarre is a polite word. Sad, tragic. For me as an American, it's embarrassing. Taking advantage of a country that needs us. And I do applaud what President Zelensky is doing. Like Simon said, he's maneuvering this, and he's becoming very popular back home. That is very clear. So if Trump wanted to make him popular and help him for re-election, it's having that effect. But I just got to say, this is not just embarrassing. It's not in America's national interest. Trump is alienating the entire free world by imposing these kinds of deals like this. And this makes us look weak. It makes us look like we don't care about values. And that's not my America, Nicole. That's not the America I believe in. We just want to do deals and we want to be reimbursed. By the way, the American people didn't ask to be reimbursed. They voted their representatives in Congress. Congress passed those legislative packages that led to that assistance. The president signed it. There's no clause that says and now you have to pay us back. So I think the president actually is out of step with a lot of Americans on this issue.
I mean, I'll play the role of the political analyst for the purposes of conversation. He is. 61% of all Americans understand the truth that Russia is responsible for the war in Ukraine, which is why you have Maria Bartiromo holding the line on who started the war. When you've lost Maria Bartiromo and you're a Republican and a Trump official, you are off the cliff. And then Quinnipiac has an overwhelming majority of Americans who don't trust Vladimir Putin. 81% of all Americans don't think Putin should be trusted. Yet that's who Donald Trump is throwing in with. How does Zelensky view this bizarre sort of hijacking of the American presidency in terms of ideology and priorities as someone who doesn't even have the American people behind him on the question of Ukraine, Simon?
I mean, it's extremely painful, and you have to understand what the Ukrainians are dealing with in parallel. Just, the last couple of nights, there have been hundreds of these Russian drones. These are terrifying machines. They fly in swarms in the middle of the night. Each of them sounds like basically a motor scooter revving its engine as it falls out of the sky. At the same time, you have, anti-aircraft weapons on the Ukrainian side trying to shoot these things down. And at the same time, you have the incoming fire from Donald Trump and many people in his administration calling the Ukrainians, the Ukrainian president, a dictator and blaming the Ukrainians for supposedly starting the war. I mean, it's a gut punch. And the way that the Ukrainians have been dealing with it, President Zelensky is dealing with it, is to stay calm, try to slow the process down. He's been getting a lot of different kinds of advice, including today, some of the officials I talked to, they're saying, okay, let's slow down. And if Trump wants this piece of paper that says, okay, we got a deal from the Ukrainians, now they're paying us, we're not paying them. Let's give him that if that will continue some form of American aid, but let's at least make sure that this agreement, if we sign it, if the Ukrainians sign it, isn't completely onerous and colonial in nature. So that's what they're negotiating over now.
It's an insane turn of events on many fronts. But in this case, there is zero mandate from the American people to capitulate to Vladimir Putin.
A significant type of blowback, including in red districts, not to the idea of Donald Trump. He won a narrow election. So the idea was just over, about 1.5 points over, half of the voting public said yes to that idea. What we're seeing now is significant, even if all the votes are in and we're in the governing era, as I've told you. And that is opposition to the reality, the policies, some of which had been hinted at, some of which from Elon Musk are very different from what was campaigned on, and we're seeing it strong, broad, and in red areas. So what are those policies? A lot of the recent, say, first month plus has focused from the federal government under the Trump administration on a cabinet that many viewed as extreme and in some places inexperienced, indiscriminate mass layoffs. That term is not an opinion or an observation. It is what people like the outgoing FDA chief, nonpartisan experts, concerned Republicans, and others have said. And the misuse of the possibly, and at times definitely, legitimate concerns in our government about waste, fraud, and abuse. Combine all that with some blunders and mistakes, which, again, not an outside opinion, but even the Trump administration has had to admit, like when they've fired people and then rushed to try to rehire them the next day, which amounts to the governing chaos of sorry, or we messed up, or how do we undo what we did yesterday? And so the American public, in ways that we're measuring tonight, and this is our top story, is hearing about this. And although there is usually a honeymoon period, and there is usually more kind of receptivity to the first 100 days, that combined with a bunch of executive orders that have gotten caught in the courts, that have drawn attention to a sort of governing style that people think may not be delivering for them, is igniting something real. New town halls, rounds of them over the weekend. You may have heard about some of this. Rachel Maddow has reported on this. You've seen some of the footage. Some of this is going viral online. So depending on how you get your news or where you live, you may have heard more or less about it. But this is a real thing, including in many red districts where Republican lawmakers, a month into this round two rebooted Trump, now Musk experiment, are facing their constituents They're being challenged over the way these cuts are being carried out, over some of the mistakes I mentioned, and clearly by an unadvertised and now hugely influential role of one unelected billionaire.
Not the president. And you are doing us a disservice to set that down and not stand up for us.
The House of Representatives and the Senate are totally abdicating their responsibility.
When are you going to wrest control as the Congress back from the executive and stop hurting your constituents? It's over.
Okay.
This is separation of powers. Yes.
Do your job. Do your job. Do your job.
When will you stand up to them and say that is enough?
He's gotten rid of birthright citizenship.
Illegal as hell.
Elon Musk's young tech aides and experts in that field seem to think that governing must be much simpler than what they do in a single lane of a single technology company. So they're walking into agencies in the federal government. Here's some footage, courtesy of 60 Minutes, on them just walking in, making their announcements, issuing press releases, and trying to use tech and even sometimes online propaganda tools where you push out information, you say it's great that you're disrupting, and sometimes they'll admit, some people in tech and elsewhere, well, they'll be a little misleading just to get the point across, to go viral. And yet we don't have a ton of new information over this month of them actually finding the waste, fraud, and abuse, certainly not more than the inspectors general that Trump fired and the other traditional means, I should say. The common tactic here, though, the common effort is under Elon Musk. And I want to remind you, we've already seen how he dabbles in these issues, whether it's sort of flying by the seat of his pants online, when he's jumped into other controversies, or in December, when there was a bipartisan spending bill, and he sabotaged. And remember, he posted multiple falsehoods, misstatements, and what appeared to be knowing, purposeful lies about it. I'm not going to repeat all the lies. We've got some of the fact-check headlines on that. But it's relevant again tonight because you have to remember this is a pattern. And if you have a pattern of misleading behavior, it makes it look more intentional than if you made a mistake, corrected it, and tried not to do it again. He bought Twitter, renamed X, to have influence on that platform. He also used it to crack down on free speech and views he disagrees with, which is legal to do with a business, but it was the opposite of what he claimed his purpose was. He tries to get what he wants out of this type of process and looks at the other stuff along the way as just kind of part of the business negotiation, a kind of collateral damage. Now, many people view this as gaming the system, as not being on the level. And again, to be as fair as possible, there are plenty of folks who could say, okay, Ari, but isn't that politics? And don't both sides do a certain amount of that? And the answer is, up to a point, yes. But those false claims I mentioned in December, which I'm not going to repeat on this factual newscast, and some of the recent efforts he has made to completely misstate what amount of cuts they're getting, kind of gives away the game. It reminds you that they're not achieving, in the first month at least, the actual amount of cuts that they think would be good enough. So they have to exaggerate, inflate, or lie. Now, in court, this wouldn't work, right? In court, there's actually a mechanism for evidence. The evidence has to be admitted. So if you say to a judge, I have made up numbers that aren't true about government cuts to prove this case about whether something's efficient, the judge would say, we're not admitting that. And the jury would never hear it. Well, the internet is a long ways from that. So these outright falsehoods are now part of our political sort of tech-shaped reality. And it's not just Elon Musk's platform, to be clear. Whatever you think of him and his Trump politics, the idea that these types of platforms have found that moving beyond truth is profitable, is sticky, is clickbait, is viral, is something we have seen across the board. Facebook famously announcing they were pulling back on fact checkers after Trump's criticisms. ProPublica noting that when you take this approach, you're pouring a type of accelerant on those false posts which the Facebook company once policed. In other words, think about it like advertising. If a very effective, very kind of popular ad, and online ads can be shared, right? They can be up, down, reposted. If a very popular ad is false, but all you're doing is selling the ad space, then maybe you don't care. Now add to that a tech agenda where you're trying to make Trump happy or prove to him that you're on his side. And you have the consequences we're living with today. I showed you the real town halls, real people out in the real world talking to their elected officials based on what they understand reality to be. But a lot of people are getting part of their reality from these tech platforms that are far from neutral and that have their own money, and some of them, their relationship with Trump, way more important to them than the truth. And remember, 86%, right? Almost 9 out of 10 Americans get their news now, what they call news, from their phone or tablet, but who knows whether they're actually getting factual news at all. These are platforms from these tech billionaires, increasingly politicized. Now, I've been careful to say this predates Trump. These issues are broader than any one party. And around the world, when we've criticized Facebook, for example, there were issues abroad that had nothing to do with strictly right-wing politics. It just had to do with whether Facebook was being a responsible steward of the countries it operated in or not. So this is, in some sense, bigger than us in America, bigger than what we saw so clearly visualized at Trump's inauguration. Let's put it in full. And you probably remember the photo. You probably watched some of it that day. But I want to really look at this for a minute, because this was years in the making. But what you got, these tech billionaires with the better seats than the cabinet, with the front row, reflecting both Trump's demand that they show up, but also their choice within this business environment and political environment to show up and say, this is the ruling elite right now, even as they claim to be disruptors and be against the elite. And we've seen several, including Zuckerberg and Musk, try to amplify their own voices as if they weren't known and famous enough, with media appearances where what they say now undercuts their past claims of just wanting to connect people or empower or be a neutral platform, because they have pushing their politics. Now, there is also the view that this is just the oldest story in the book. Money, greed, self-interest. They want Trump for financial reasons, lower tax cuts, the stock market, less regulation, all these things that traditional Republican administrations promise. And we had some reporting that when the markets rallied in those first few weeks of the Trump administration, it was another sign people pointed to saying on the right, well, look, markets don't lie. They clearly like Trump. This will be good for everybody. Trickle down. And for a few weeks, the markets were up. Of course, the performance of any large-scale market is far from guaranteed. And last week, we actually saw by the end of the week on paper, nearly all post-inauguration stock market gains wiped out.
Stocks falling hard to end this shortened trading week.
The week-to-date numbers, everybody's in the red.
I think we likely have a little bit more downside here.
We just don't know what the tariffs are going to bring. Nobody should be surprised that consumer sentiment took a pretty dramatic dip last month.
All this belief of this being the most pro-business administration that has existed in the post-war period is starting to be questioned.
You can definitely say that the administration wants to be pro-business and wants to work at least with the business and tech leaders who are willing to bow to Trump's agenda. But that doesn't necessarily mean that what we're getting in this first month are the kind of long-term baseline levels of stability and credibility of a federal government in a complex world that gives the markets what they need, to say nothing of the tariff war and all the other complexities that we call in The Economist to explain. And yet, those tech leaders are clearly eager for now to stay in Trump's orbit, to echo what he says he's doing, to go on all these podcasts, as I mentioned, which is, with all respect to journalism, to the New York Times, or the TV networks that we work with, those podcasts I'm showing you on the screen are how many tens of millions of people hear about things these days. And what we're seeing is a very different approach than 10 years ago from these people. And remember, they have a lot more control. They have the algorithm, they can turn things up or down, they can decide what is going to be popular or fact-checked, and then they themselves, on top of all that power, want to go out and do it themselves with their own voice, while then lecturing people about free speech principles that, quite frankly, several of them have flatly contradicted.
Mentioned Democratic strategist James Carville. He's out with a bold prediction, saying that the Trump administration and Republican lawmakers will suffer a massive collapse in 30 days. Let's take a look.
What I've said very publicly, the Democrats need to play possum. This whole thing is collapsing. It doesn't need Elizabeth Warren and somebody screaming to pacify some progressive advocacy groups in Washington, which, by the way, I wish these people were just useless. They're actually worse than useless, that they're detrimental. And they never, ever learn to shut up. And so, Dan, this is what I believe. I believe that this administration, in less than 30 days, in the midst of a massive collapse, and particularly a collapse in public opinion, it's going to be easy pickings here in 6 weeks. Just lay back.
So you literally think 30 days to 6 weeks, the Trump administration is effectively going to collapse in terms of public support?
Well, it's collapsing right now. We're in the midst of a collapse. This is the lowest approval, not even close, that any president has ever had at a comparable time. Again, that's a provable fact. So they're not going to be able to get a debt extension. That's pretty clear. I don't think they're going to be able to pass reconciliation, but I'm not sure. But they're going to have to go to Hakeem. And that is going to be the equivalent of stacking arms. It's over.
Well, that is certainly
pronouncement.
That's certainly one view of it. Again, going back to Wide World of News, Halpern also quotes from Heather Cox Richardson's newsletter, her quote of Timothy Snyder, who is a scholar on authoritarianism, who said, "Something is shifting. They are still breaking things and stealing things, and they will keep trying to break and steal. But the propaganda magic around the oligarchical coup is fading. Nervous Musk, nervous Trump." And the point is, not that necessarily everything's going to be over in 30 days or that things are going to collapse in 30 days. But Democrats, for the first time since Election Day, and this is what Halpern's Wide World of News is saying, for the first time since Election Day, Democrats are starting to see an opening. And with that opening, a lot of questions, Mika, about who will lead this party.
Right. Joining us now, co-founder, CEO of Axios, Jim VandeHei, and journalist, editor, and author of the newsletter Fresh Hell, available on Substack, Tina Brown.
Still my favorite topic for a newsletter.
The BBC's Katty Kay is still with us as well. She's the host of the Rest is Politics podcast, which is amazing as well.
Yeah. So, Jim VandeHei, you've actually written about, Axios has actually written about this, which is the sort of different camps that we have right now for leaders who want to take charge of the Democratic Party and lead the fight against Republicans and Donald Trump. Talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Carville's spot on in his analysis. Like, he's got to look at where the Democratic Party is right now, right? We also have polls showing Democrats have never been, as a party, more unpopular than they are at this moment. On top of that, they don't have much power, right? If you don't control the Senate, you don't control the House, you don't control the White House, you don't control the courts. There's only so many levers that you can actually pull. So the debate inside the party is, do you accept that some of the things that Donald Trump wants to do directionally might be correct, and that put sort of Governor Whitmer or Governor Polis in Colorado in that camp, saying, listen, maybe they're with them on tariffs or part of tariffs, maybe they're with them on the border, and conceding that things need to be done and not that every day doesn't need to be a fight. That's one camp. I think the others here, Chris Murphy's a senator from Connecticut, or J.D. Pritzker in Illinois, people who are from very liberal states where they have the freedom to be in sort of the warfare mindset, day in, day out, hour in, hour out. And I think that is the big fight. I think we know the way politics works is Trump's going to live or die based on his performance. Like, tell me what inflation looks like in a month, tell me what the jobless rate looks like, tell me where wages are, and tell me how much chaos flows from some of the decisions of the first 30 days, and I'll tell you kind of where his public standing is and whether or not Republicans will break. But so far, there's zero sign. You saw it. You had it this morning. The idea that no Republican will speak up and say, hey, maybe Vladimir Putin's a thug. Maybe he's a dictator.
Yeah.
Maybe he's been hell-bent for his entire life, starting at the KGB to destroy your nation. Maybe Zelensky, you could argue whether or not we should be there or not there. You can't argue like, oh, he started the war when someone invaded me. And yet you don't have a single Republican who says, hey, that's crazy. That's counter everything we've ever believed in our careers. And I think that speaks to the power Trump will have until those poll numbers go way the hell down.
Well, yeah, until if inflation goes up or those poll numbers go down, the economy goes down. Exactly. I think you're right. I don't see that happening within 30 days. But you are right. I mean, Vladimir Putin has seen the United States of America as an enemy his entire life. And yet here we are. Not a single Republican willing to stand up and speak out aggressively against what President Trump has been saying. You know, Tina, your latest piece in Fresh Hell has this line, and I do agree with you, because I have noticed that since the election, most Democratic leaders have been stunned. One real exception to that has been Rahm Emanuel, who time and time again, with his language, strips things down to their bare essentials. And if let's say he's talking about DEI, or let's say he's talking about trans athletes, or talking about some of these hot button issues that Democrats fumble around on, Rahm, he'll have a line for it, which is the Democratic Party is popular when they're the party of acceptance. They are unpopular when they're a party of authoritarianism on these social issues, or they're the party of advocacy, shoving all of these issues in Americans' faces, even when they don't want to. Acceptance, yes. Stern advocacy, no.
Absolutely right. I mean, God, how much do I love James Carville, by the way. But Rahm, you know, he knows how to communicate. And, you know, he actually says, you know, the messenger is the message, because Democrats like to go on about, like, we have to get the message right. Well, the messenger has to be right, too. And Rahm is able to speak with clarity, which is so missing from the kind of mothballed, you know, euphemistic verbiage, you know, that the Democrats tend to speak in. And he says, you know, Democrats tend to defend they defend the process instead of the results. And it's absolutely true. You know, I mean, much though I love Elizabeth Warren, the sight of her sort of parading around with a sign saying, you know, save our CPB, it's like, what's the next thing? You know, save our IRS. I mean, you know, this acronyms and sort of, you know, it's lame. It's lame. And Rahm is never lame. He has this amazing expertise, which is, of course, wildly out of fashion to have any expertise. But when you think that he was, you know, chief of staff, that he was, you know, ambassador to Japan, that he was mayor of Chicago, the guy has a, you know, he's a practitioner. He's not an advisor, although he has been. He's a practitioner. He's been in, you know, in the throng and the throes of the real sort of heat of politics. And he understands what really works and what doesn't. He knows how to communicate. And yet, you know, he's also brilliant. So I think we need people like him who are intellectually top-notch, but who are communicating in ways that people can understand with clarity.
Tina, beyond Rahm Emanuel, when you look around the country and you look particularly to the next election, obviously Democrats are hoping that they're going to find a candidate who can run for president in 4 years' time, who can take on whoever it is, J.D. Vance or whoever is the heir to Donald Trump. Who do you see that makes you excited, makes you hopeful for the Democrats' chances in the next election?
Well, I do think that is too early. I mean, I wish that Rahm would run himself, and I don't see why he shouldn't. I think he could and he should. But I think that, you know, it's probably going to be at, you know, at the sort of much lower levels of politics. It's not going to come from the big crowd that we see out there at the top. It's going to come from the sort of the Johnny Appleseeds who are being sort of grown. And I think that Rahm himself is a great believer in that, which is to grow, you know, right from the grassroots, new leaders who can come up and somehow get into the mix. That's what we're really going to need. But whoever it is, they've got to have communication skills. They've got to be able to think and talk at the same time. And if they don't have those skills, you know, get out of my face. I don't want to see anybody else who people say, you know, behind closed doors, he's really fabulous. He's, you know, we had that with John Kerry. We've had that with people like Romney. I mean, they don't win those people. The people who can only be stars behind closed doors, you know, stay behind closed doors. That's my message to them.
So, Jim VandeHei, you've been pretty consistent and clear in the last few months just about the uphill climb Democrats have ahead of them in the wake of November's election. And one thing I've been hearing from a lot of people in the party, especially in recent weeks, is the sort of lack of leadership. Yes, Rahm Emanuel perhaps could fill that role, but right now they're looking around, they're not really seeing it. They're not sure that Minority Leader Jeffries or Schumer are right now meeting this moment. It's too early, perhaps, for the 2028 presidential field to emerge. What's your assessment here? Who should be filling the gap in the way that during the first Trump term, 2017, 2018, that first wave of Trumpism, it was Nancy Pelosi who stepped into the breach?
Yeah, I mean, listen, over the last 20 years, we've had similar thumpings by both parties. And when you come out of an election where you have no party control, every party goes through this and everyone's hopeless and, oh, my God, we have no leaders. There's not a single leader who could step up. There's not a single Democrat right now who can command a national attention because of either their position. Like Chuck Schumer is just not it. He has power in the Senate, but he's just not a national figure like that. And the way that politics works, the way power works, is that it's almost always a reaction to who's in power now. And so whatever Trump does, it will feed that reaction. And if he's unpopular, then little by little Republicans will break from him potentially, and it will give a clear opening for Democrats to figure out how do you run against a guy who doesn't do or believe or say anything that you thought anybody could and get away with it in American politics. And so all the power flows through him. The reason that I'm not as certain as others that Republicans will break as quickly from Trump if things go poorly is this combination of Musk and Trump. Like the new dynamic, and you saw that in the nominating process, is that when you have the power of the presidency and the power of sort of the information warfare machine aimed at you, almost no one has the courage to stand up and take the bullet. Nobody. You go back to a month and a half ago, had you said that this crop of people were going to be nominated to be cabinet officials and that all of them would get through, we were saying we thought they would get through because we've kind of seen the dynamic with this Republican Party, but most people thought they'd be defeated. They wouldn't. It's the reason you see everyone being quiet or playing word games with Russia. It's why you see everyone being quiet or playing word games with Gaza, or why when the president picks a podcaster to be the number 2 at the FBI, where you now have 2 loyalists running the FBI, not 2 people who have a lot of experience with a massive bureaucracy that has extreme power over the entirety of the United States. They're not looking at experience. Like the reason that Republicans don't speak out of it is fear. And the only way you get rid of fear is by eradicating the amount of authority and popularity that Trump has right now.
CEO of Axios, Jim VandeHei, and the author of the newsletter Fresh Hell, available on Substack. Tina Brown, thank you. It's so good to see you.
And Tina, let me just say, as I do every so often, I've been getting Harry's book out and going back and rereading through, because I think it's incredible. Do I make myself clear? The great Harold Evans could have written that. He could have written it yesterday. It is still as vital. It is still as important today as ever before, isn't it?
Oh, totally, totally. I mean, he could condense this much to this much. And that's what you have to do to get anyone's attention, particularly now, in the era when nobody, has 2 minutes to do anything except this.
Yeah, exactly.
Nailed it. All right.
To direct the day-to-day functioning of the agency responsible for preventing and investigating terror attacks, responding to mass shootings, investigating international drug cartels and gangs, thwarting cyber attacks, and arresting violent criminals and investigating public corruption, among other things. Donald Trump has tapped a podcaster and right-wing media personality who once said this, quote, "My entire life right now is owning the libs." That person is named Dan Bongino. He will be the deputy director of the FBI, the number 2 at the country's top law enforcement agency. It is a job that does not require Senate confirmation. Not that Republicans have had any objection to any of Trump's picks anyway. But if you're not familiar with Bongino, here's a small sampling of the things he's had to say over the years.
Trump is an apex predator. He's the Lion King. Trump went out there tonight and did what Trump does. He's the shark in the ocean, and he acted like it. He lost no one from his base. No one.
Shame on us if we don't enter the legal profession and start to pull people out of the DOJ. I have no problem with Donald Trump investigating Jack Smith either, and you shouldn't either. But Jack Smith doesn't have a pardon. What happened yesterday with President Trump and the targeting of him and his attorneys by this piece of human scum, all of these people targeting him in the Justice Department that have forfeited any semblance of allegiance and fidelity to the constitutional republic. I do not need power-drunk pseudo-monarchs, little mini tyrants in my supposedly conservative county, though, sending out ridiculous, childlike amateur hour edicts demanding people wear masks in situations where the risk of transmission is somewhat close to zero. You can take your mask mandate and shove it right up your The Karate Man, I never thought I'd have to use it in real life. But guess, reminds me of like the House of Pain. Remember Guess Who's Back by House of Pain? Geraldo's back. He wants to fight me again. Why does this guy always want to fight me? Why does everybody always want to fight Dan Bongino? Why? Why does everybody want to fight me all the time? Do I have a punchable face or something?
The conspiracy theories, the outrage, the tightness of the T-shirts, all of it surely floats Donald Trump's boat and is music to his ears. It's likely part of the very essence of the reason he was selected. But the job of Deputy Director of the FBI, the United States of America, is a serious job that affects every person living here, people around the world. It's the kind of job that has to be done well by whomever does it. If the Bureau stands any chance of actually catching real bad guys. As the Washington Post reports, quote, the deputy director answers to the director, serving as the agency's second in command, responsible for day-to-day law enforcement operations and all of the FBI's domestic and international investigative and intelligence activities. The FBI has 55 field offices, 60 offices abroad, 38,000 staffers, and a budget of $10 billion. Managing the day-to-day affairs of the FBI is a serious responsibility, and traditionally that post of Deputy Director of the FBI has gone to a career FBI agent. In fact, the FBI Agents Association says that in a meeting in January, before Kash Patel was confirmed, they told Patel this, quote, the FBI Deputy Director should continue to be an onboard active special agent. This has been the case for 117 years for many compelling reasons, including operational expertise and experience, as well as the trust of our special agent population. According to the FBI Agents Association, at the time, Kash Patel agreed and said that the job should go to a career FBI agent. Now, Patel either changed his mind or was overruled, but he's given an already wary workforce another reason to be suspicious and distrustful of him. And the FBI now has at its helm what the New York Times describes this way, quote, the least experienced leadership pair in the Bureau's history. Donald Trump's choice of a pro-Trump podcaster to be the number 2 at the FBI is where we start today. NBC News justice reporter, author of Sedition Hunters, How January 6 Broke the Justice System, Ryan Riley's back, plus former lead investigator for the January 6 Select Committee, author of Harbingers, What January 6 and Charlottesville Reveal About Rising Threats to American Democracy. Tim Hafey's back. Also joining us, former top official at the Department of Justice, MSNBC legal analyst Andrew Weissman's here. Ryan Riley, you have some great reporting on how this is being received inside the FBI. Tell us about it.
Yeah, I think a lot of eye rolls sort of within the FBI. But remember, there is a contingent within the FBI who is very supportive of Donald Trump and some of the moves that he is making. But when, Dan Bongino was announced, what my brain immediately went to was actually an interaction that he had with a former FBI special agent who's also now a podcaster, Kyle Seraphin. He's someone who is in very close communication with Kash Patel. Kash Patel's foundation, before Kash Patel was FBI director, actually had paid Kyle Seraphin's family, along with a couple of other right-wing FBI special agents. And there was this falling out because there's just disagreement about how this Mar-a-Lago raid was being discussed because Dan Bongino accepted this sort of premise that there was something untoward about the Mar-a-Lago search, that the FBI had messed up there. And Kyle Seraphin looked at those documents and said that, no, this is actually really standard operating procedure. So there was this enormous falling out, even though basically Dan Bongino was the reason that Kyle Seraphin got onto the radar of Kash Patel and received that money. That's where he did his first interview, for example, when Kyle Seraphin was still this FBI whistleblower. There was this falling out over just basic facts because, Kyle, for everything about him, he's someone who is very much so about, establishing the facts. And the facts is that this was standard operating procedure, how that search was conducted. The FBI did not have a plot to assassinate Donald Trump when they searched Mar-a-Lago when Donald Trump was all the way in New Jersey. So, you very quickly see this sort of breaking out into a different realm where, you have a deputy director of the FBI now who just doesn't seem very dedicated to the facts based on what you just presented there and based upon a lot of the rhetoric that we've seen previously. Of course, I should say Dan Bongino is, in his first appearance, I guess, today or last show today, was saying that he's now taking on a different role. But within the Bureau, there's just, this comes on top of just so much in the past month plus that has really just rocked the Bureau to its core. This isn't going to help that entire situation, Nicole.
Andrew Weissman, NBC is reporting this, quote, "This is really concerning. Any hope that Kash could be steered by having experienced leaders around him is out the window. We now have two conspiracy theorists and election deniers running our premier law enforcement and intelligence agency. That is beyond problematic." I think that some of what is public facing, right, is investigating crimes that go on to be prosecuted. But some of what I think is opaque to the vast majority of Americans is that the FBI is a massive intelligence and national security agency. And national security cases are not cases that are always tried in a courtroom. Sometimes no one ever knows the details. But Kash Patel and Dan Bongino will also be in charge of that. How will that work?
Well, I think the idea that you have two people with a grand total of zero experience working at the FBI it's not just problematic. That is, it makes you question whether the goal here is to not have an effective FBI at all, to basically be hollowing it out. When you think about what those leaders have to do, one is they have to inspire people. They have to give confidence. These are public servants who give up a lot, and you have to sort of make sure that they feel supported and that they are rewarded for doing a good job. But you also need people who can spot key issues, who can guide them appropriately. And if they don't have experience at the Bureau, neither one of them, I pray that they learn on the job quickly, but that is not what you want in this group, and particularly in the national security area. I remember Director Mueller, who I was the general counsel for, and it was a privilege to serve with him. I mean, you could feel every day that he and the deputy director, what weighed on them was the idea that there would be some terrorist incident here or abroad where people would be hurt. That is such, it's important to have that work ethic, but it's important to have that depth of experience to know where to look and what is noise and what is real. And that, to me, was the thing that I found remarkable in watching those two men, as well as Andrew McCabe and a host of other people. And the idea that you would pick people who don't have that skill set and hope that they get that skill set on the job is beyond, it's just beyond imaginable in terms of just from an apolitical perspective, what you want in terms of making this country safe.